afternoon and welcome to our intro on the cloud. My name is Daryl Burling. I'm the product manager for Microsoft New Zealand here. Actually not here in Auckland, I'm actually based in Wellington. I look after SharePoint, Exchange and Microsoft Online Services.
My name is Ben Keeps. Despite the shirt that I'm wearing today, slightly under duress, I don't work for Microsoft. I'm a bunch of different things. I'm a blogger. I'm a blogger with Gigaron, which is a US blogging network. I'm a commentator, analyst, I guess an entrepreneur, whatever that word means. Do a bunch of different things, helping advisory stuff with technology startups. And I guess my bio from the TechEd program says it all. My head's in the cloud. So what we want to do here is just a really sort of basic 101, even though it says 203 on the program, about the cloud. You all signed up to do basic meteorology, didn't you? No? Yeah, that was a joke. Okay, that's right. It's after lunch. We'll take it as we come. So I'm really aware that there's a bunch of us that are kind of early adopters on the really bleeding edge, if you like, that this stuff is all totally obvious to. There's another world out there, and it's the world of very much the majority that don't know about the stuff and don't know what it is. So for those of you that this is just really basic level stuff, sorry, but that's just the way it is, because there's a bunch of people that need to hear the basics. So with that, we'll stick to it and get in with it. So a little bit of scene setting here. Just want to look through some of the 6 paradigms of computing and reflect on where we're at now. So this here is ENIAC. Way back before my time and even before Daryl's time, this was arguably the first computational device. I mean, obviously there were things like the abacus and all those sorts of things, but this was the sort of first computational machine, if you like. Big and scary and lots of moving parts and lots of noise and very mechanical. The next thing here, you can tell by the dress sense, this was about 4 years ago. This is the mainframe era. So this is where we had half a dozen machines. This is where that famous quote from IBM came that there's only ever going to be a global market for 6 computers or something like that. I know it's misquoted everywhere you read it, but it was something like that. So the idea here was that we all shared a bunch of machinery and we sort of rented time, and it took, again, a technician. Admittedly, this time the technician could maybe wear a suit, but it was still a very qualified technician that would run that stuff. Next up came the personal computer, which in theory gave computing to the masses. It meant that every workplace, every home, in theory, could have one of these things. They were still pretty bloody expensive, but a lot more attainable than grabbing a mainframe and sticking it in your bathroom. This one here is for Tim Howe, who we've got down in the audience. Who in the audience remembers Bits and Bytes magazine? Okay, you're either showing your age or you're showing that you're an import from the UK. The ones that don't get that. So Bits and Bytes was a magazine from around the mid-80s, a computer magazine in New Zealand. It's really interesting. Other than the reference to Tim Howe, who used to write for it in the late 80s, it's really interesting because this was back in the day when computer enthusiasts programmed BASIC and used a soldering iron. And that's kind of the history from whence we've come. And you think about it now where you walk out on the street and people are carrying iPhones and iPads and other non-Apple devices even. And we've come through a revolution, it has to be said. And speaking to that, mobile devices, we've got a situation here where information and access to data is completely ubiquitous. I've got a mobile device, I've got an iPad, I've got laptops, I've got desktops, I've got all that stuff. And where the data is really doesn't matter. And so when we think about these paradigms, you think about that in some ways the cloud is taking us back to the mainframe era where the data was kind of stored in one place or in a couple of places. But the difference here is that now that data, or the access to that data, is now ubiquitous. Anywhere, anytime, I can get access to that data, and that's a really empowering thing.
One of the other things that's really important to note here is that we're taking that sort of centralized repository of information and we're sort of going back to that, but at the same time we now have these distributed devices, which means that really we're taking all these past paradigms and mashing them all together And the cloud is really that central piece that brings it all together as one giant computing experience.
Yeah, it's awesome. And so moving on from that, what comes next? Well, this here, I mean, it doesn't really matter what this device is. This is a device called the Morph that was won a design competition a few months back, and that was basically a smart device and a cell phone that would change shape. It could be worn as a bracelet or a watch. It's got that Bluetooth headset thingy there. But basically what this is saying is that computing and access to data and interacting with that data is really situational, is really ubiquitous, anywhere, anytime, anyhow. And it's really interesting, and it's kind of humorous. So this picture here is from a few months ago, and this was very much a concept. Imagine if you could get a device with a camera and take a picture of a building, and you could actually get some information about that building fed to you through the internet. Well, that isn't the concept. There's a startup in the US called Layar, L-A-Y-A-R, that does stuff like this. It's augmented reality, and today you can do stuff like this. So the speed of acceleration of this stuff is just amazing what we can achieve, and all that stuff. The common theme here is that is all empowered and enabled by the cloud. There's no way that device could contain the data about every single building in that city or in the world or in that country or whatever, but it's fed down from the internet. And so we've got a bit of a video to show you that looks at the future and kind of thinks about what the future would look like. It's a Microsoft produced video, but equally it could work across any provider. But just when you're watching it, think about the fact that all this stuff is powered by the cloud. All this data isn't on the device necessarily, but it comes down from the cloud. Rah-rah, as they say. So I don't know about you guys, but I grew up using a soldering iron, and I had a ZX81, and I programmed it in BASIC, and I had 1K of RAM, and all that sort of stuff. So I know all about that history, but none of that stuff actually interests me that much anymore. It's that stuff that's amazing. I mean, that's really, really exciting. That is world changing, and that's going to change our lives and the lives. More importantly, it's going to change the lives of everyone out there. And that stuff's powered by the cloud. I get kind of emotional when I talk about the cloud. You'll have to excuse me. So I want to do a quick 101 here about utilities. And basically this is an excuse for me to show some gratuitous images of stuff that I've made. So you'll have to excuse me. So let's face it, we're all geeks here. There's a bunch of different types of geeks. There's geeks with geek tattoos. This guy's going to be really screwed when HTML finally dies. There's geeks with really bad dress sense. The only example, or the only analogy I can draw from this is that it was Bill Gates 20 years ago. And then there's geeks with spinal compression. Now, you've got to really laud this guy's multitasking abilities, but I'd really hate to be his chiropractor. But beyond all that stuff, we don't all have a single dimension. We all do other things. So this is a nice photo. This is actually the mountains. This isn't CGI. This is the real world. There you go. That's the mountains. So we can do other stuff. And so I wanted to kind of share some stories. And this is going to get a little bit drawn out, but believe me, there's an analogy here to cloud computing. And so a few years ago, I decided to work part-time and build a house part-time. So this is the house that I built in rural North Canterbury. And decided to build all the stuff inside the house as well. So I built the beds. These are the beds, or this is one of the beds, matching beds that my 10 and 8-year-old sons sleep in. On the left-hand side, that's a bookcase. For those that don't know what books are anymore, there's no DRM issues whatsoever with that, and there's not an e-reader in the house. On the right-hand side, that's a stereo. So don't know if anyone's come across those anymore, but they were what you had before iPods were invented. This is the ooh-ah moment. This is the cradle that the kids were in when they were babies. The moon and the stars indicates that either they're going to be astrophysicists or hippies. We're not sure which. And so what I'm trying to get at here is all that stuff was made in something like this, which is a joinery factory. Joinery factory today is a kind of big and spacious and light and airy and reasonably noisy, but not too bad, and reasonably clean. So compare that a little bit to this romantic idea we have of a few hundred years ago, when joinery factories weren't actually quite so romantic. They were dirty and they were noisy and they were dusty. And there's a dude there that has to wear a tie to work in a joinery factory. Go figure. I don't even wear a tie to work in an office. And they were really kind of backwards from our perspective of today. How did they work? And how does this relate to the cloud? Water. There's a river. So in the old days, rivers turned a water wheel. Got another image of a water wheel there, just for those people that want to see some action images. So that water wheel turned some pulleys, which turned some pistons, that created some motive power to make some joinery machinery run. Kind of simple. Compare it to today. What's the difference? How come a factory today is light and spacious and airy and not so noisy and not a lot of dust, and the factory of the old days was this horrible place to work? Well, it's these things here. Now, you may not like Iron Maidens walking across your countryside. I mean, I've got one on the property adjoining me, and it's not the loveliest thing. But what I really like is when I get home at night and it's cold, I can flick a switch and turn the heater on. Or if I want to use my computer, I can flick a switch and turn the power on. How does that happen? I don't have a generating plant in my backyard. I don't own a river that has a hydro scheme on it. I don't have wind turbines. How does that happen? It happens because we've got this utility electricity model. And that's a really, really powerful thing. Both of those things, to a greater or lesser extent, come from water. One just aggregates a bunch of that stuff together and does it en masse. The other is done on an individual level. Now, obviously, there's some issues with that. This here, for those that don't know, is a photo when it was being constructed of the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is the biggest hydro dam in the world. So, you know, there's bad things that come from aggregation and doing things en masse as well. And definitely, that little water wheel was very different from the massive Three Gorges Dam. But there's other opportunities there as well. You know, we're not going to get into the whys and wherefores of electricity generation, but just bear in mind that there's a utility model there, and the utility model brings a real efficiency to people. And that's why you can all go home tonight and turn on a light switch and your lights turn on.
I think going back to the model you were talking about before with the factory, the key thing is that in the old days they would have a water wheel next to a river which would turn their, you know, move their belts and move the saws, and that's how that would work. Today the factory doesn't have to have its own river and its own turbine and its own water wheel because we just flick a switch. So in other words, the utility has changed the way the factory works. In the same way, the utility model is now what the cloud is to the computing paradigm.
Sure, that's exactly right. And at the end of the day, if you were a joiner 200 years ago, you also had to be a hydrologist. You had to have a mechanical ability to go and fix your water wheel. You had to know how the belts worked and all that sort of stuff Today, if you're a joiner, you need to know how to turn on a joinery machine and do all the joinery stuff. It's about core business. I want to abstract all the stuff that isn't core to my business away from me. In the same way, when at home, when you flick a light switch and you turn a light on, you don't actually want to know about watts and amps and volts and generation and power factor correction and all that sort of stuff. You just want someone else to sort all that stuff out for you. And so that's what it's all about. Cloud is a utility model, just like electricity is. So let's look at some definitions here. We've got a couple of ways of defining cloud. One's a lot friendlier than the other. So there's an organisation in the US called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they came up with this definition here. I'm not Generation Y. I'm a few years the other side of that, but I still don't have the attention span to read all that. So I kind of paraphrase that by saying that they're not actually sure what cloud computing is, but it's really, really important, so you've got to know about it. I prefer a much nicer definition, and it's a really good definition for the after-lunch presentation session when everyone's a little bit tired. Does anyone know what that is? It's not a trick question. No, it's not a ginger slice. Who was following on Twitter? Obviously not. So that's a Tim Tam. Could be any biscuit. Have to disclose that. But I'm a bit of a fan of Tim Tams, and Daryl's a fan of Tim Tams as well. And so think of cloud computing just like Tim Tams. You know, you go out to the shop, or you decide you want a Tim Tam. You're kind of feeling a bit peckish. You want a biscuit. So you can buy a packet of Tim Tams. And if you want one Tim Tam, you can take one Tim Tam and leave the packet closed and take the rest when you want some more. If you decide you're kind of hungry, want some more, you buy another packet. You just buy as many as you need. It's a nice analogy, and we thought that it might be a really good idea to help other people really embrace the cloud and take the opportunity of seeing just how scalable the cloud is. So Daryl's cruising around with some Tim Tams for special people. Stay around. We've got a bunch of other stuff to talk about, but at the end we're going to have a Q&A session. And those that come up with really, really good questions, not dumb questions like how come Microsoft does this or how come Apple does that or any of that stuff, but really, really good cloud computing related questions, and there might be some more Tim Tams for you. So now's a good opportunity. I've given you a bit of background. It's a good opportunity to see where, this is a Microsoft event after all, where Microsoft plays and what Microsoft considers their place in the cloud is. Over to you, Daryl.
Sure. So the way Microsoft thinks about the cloud, you know, we can sort of put this in a bit of a 3x3 grid. Now along the sides there, you've kind of got your applications. This is the end user piece. This is what you as an end user will interact with. You've got the platform piece, which is where a developer's going to interact. This is where you're going to write your code, and drop your code, and run your code. And then you've got your infrastructure, which is the bit that sits underneath that. Now, in our sort of the way we look at the world, we've kind of traditionally, if you look at Microsoft, you'd think on-premise. We do on-premise software. That's kind of what Microsoft does. That means that we build software, deliver it to you guys, and you guys then go and implement that in your data center or in your server room or whatever it happens to be. And of course, we also think about things in terms of the public cloud. So this is where, you don't have a data center, but we do. And as you've probably noticed throughout TechEd so far, this is a big emphasis for Microsoft. We're really putting a lot of effort into that. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. From a product perspective, this is kind of the way it falls. So an end user is going to interact directly with Exchange, for instance. They will use Outlook, of course, as the client interface, but they could also equally use Office Outlook Web Access. Same with SharePoint. These are tools that end users will interact with one-on-one. At the platform level, a developer's going to write some code, run it on .NET, which sits on top of IIS and gets served up as a web page or whatever, and the data gets stored in, say, SQL Server. And then at an infrastructure level, we've got the plumbing, if you like. These are the pieces of the puzzle that connect your application with the rest of the world. So your authentication and your security, your management, and even the virtual machines that it runs on top of. So in the public cloud side of things, you can see here we've got very similar kind of story on the public cloud side as well. So we have Exchange Online, which is a cloud-based version of Exchange. SharePoint Online, Office web apps, and more will come into this space. On the platform side, we have Windows Azure and SQL Azure, and of course we've got other technologies in the roadmap to cover off that infrastructure piece. Now, the other thing we have that you may or may not be aware of is this middle ground, which is what we call partner hosted. The idea here is that you may not want to have a data center. If your business is making biscuits, you know, the last thing you want to do is have a sub-business of managing data centers, because managing data centers is actually reasonably complex. And I've worked in enough IT departments to know that it's something that if you're running a business, there are other things that you'd probably rather do than be on the butt end of actually answering phone calls to do with why can't I connect to my server. So we offer the opportunity here for partners to actually host these solutions and then on-sell them to customers. And this is through a licensing system we call SPLA. Actually, we don't call it SPLA, we just made an acronym out of the bigger word, and I don't remember what it actually means. So the partner hosted, again, you've got Exchange and SharePoint, you've got the platform side of it with SQL, and of course you've got your virtual data centers with your Hyper-V and those sorts of things as well. And this is kind of how we think. So if you think about this from a cloud perspective, software as a service is something that we offer in that public cloud space as an application layer. Platform as a service is something that Microsoft offers. Again, we're using SQL Azure and Windows Azure. And then of course with the infrastructure piece, the IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service, which you'll hear about in a bit more in a few minutes, we've also got an offering around that as well. Now if you think about what we've been talking about at TechEd for the last 5, 6 years, we've been talking about software plus services. How many of you have heard of the idea of software plus services? Quite a few. Great. The idea of software plus services, you know, and originally this came out as a, you know, when we look at the SaaS space, you know, we think about, you know, SaaS is really, you know, an application delivered through a browser. And when we looked at that, we thought, well, that's great. And in certain scenarios, it's going to work wonderfully. But what about if you've got a scanner? How are you going to get that scanner to talk to that application? You know, for barcode scanning, you know, document scanning, whatever it might happen to be. And so there's this area where, you know, sometimes the SaaS kind of model just doesn't quite work. What about when you're on a plane? You know, HTML5 is going to help a lot with offline, you know, data and that sort of thing, but at the same time, you know, that's something a traditional client is going to do a great job of out of the box, because that's what they're kind of built to do. So from a software plus services perspective, this is where we've got, you know, it's not a one way or the other. We're all about trying to provide the opportunity for you to build an application to do either or both, even. And in fact, Exchange is the classic application that you'll often hear a Microsoft person talk about when it comes to software plus services, because since 1998, we've had Office Web Access baked into Exchange Server, which means that you can, you know, have your Exchange and your mail delivered through a software as a service model, or you can continue to use Outlook or another mail client to access that. And so from a Microsoft perspective, when you think about the way this covers off, you know, the whole stack, we've got this 3x3 grid, and we're working very, very hard to make sure we cover all of the different areas of that grid. So that's kind of where our vision comes in. It's not a vision that's kind of off on the side to do its own thing. It's actually a vision that has come out of our traditional software model and now is moving heavily into the cloud. So I want to take a few minutes just to explore some of the people that we compete with as well, very quickly, just in terms of where they fit on this grid. And we'll start with Oracle, because in spite of the fact that in the late 90s, Larry Ellison was touting the NetPC. Do you remember that? NetPC? Yeah, it was an idea ahead of its time in many ways. But now Larry has turned around the other way and he said, you know, this whole cloud thing is just a fad. We think it's going to pass. We're not really interested in investing in that space. And so that leaves Oracle out on the on-premises piece, and maybe you could argue in the partner-hosted bit, although I don't think their licensing is set up for resale, but it doesn't put them into the public cloud space. VMware has traditionally been very strong in terms of you know, your data center and a partner data center, but again, they're only at that bottom level in the infrastructure space. Although just recently with their acquisition of Zimbra and their recent release of the Zimbra Collaboration Suite, they're actually now up in that top right-hand corner with the public cloud as well. But again, they're crossing over, just like Cisco is, to get into that space, where they're predominantly about partner-hosted or about public cloud from an application perspective. but they don't necessarily have the platform piece. Google is a company that we all think of as being the cloud company, but they still don't have a full-blown IaaS solution. They've got storage coming, but it's not quite there yet. And again, the other one is we talk about is Amazon. And the key thing to bear in mind with both Amazon and Google is that when you make a choice to go to one of those providers, that's it. You don't get the option of kind of having a hybrid solution as easily. You can't have half of your storage easily, half that storage in the cloud and half of it on-premise. You can replicate.
marketplace? Anyone? Okay, so a bunch of people. So there's a huge amount of stuff that you need to do in order to sell a product that isn't related to the product at all. One of those things is subscription and billing. And so with software as a service, you might have 5 users that want to buy your product, and you have to charge them by the month. And then all of a sudden, you might have in the middle of the month 2 more users on that account join up, and 2 weeks later, 1 user drop off. And then you might have a customer that comes to you and says, oh, hang on, we don't really want to pay by the month, but we'd quite like to pay by the transaction. Can you do that for us? Now, if you're a developer that's building a product, building all the functionality to do that stuff is it's a lot of cans of Red Bull. There's a product out there called Chargify, and there's a bunch of other products. I'm just using it as an example because Connect to Field use it. And it's a third-party subscription and billing platform, so it has all that stuff built into it. It connects to all the payment gateways, and you connect it to your app, and all that subscription and billing stuff just happens without you having to think about it. So you've abstracted all that stuff away from yourself. Your core competency is building your software. Your core competency isn't building subscription and billing or doing all the other stuff. Just a few more examples, we'll quickly go through them. Their public website, Connect to Field, it's WordPress, which is a content management system, and that's up there on Amazon, so they don't store it on their own servers. And then from their sales side of things, they have a customer relations CRM system. In this case, it's Capsule, which is a startup that was actually started up by an ex-Kiwi guy in the UK. And then they use things like GoToMeeting and local phone for their local voice over IP numbers. So it's just thinking about, as a startup, think about your core competency, and anything that isn't directly related to that, get someone else to do it. In the same way that I really don't want, well actually I would quite like to have a windmill in my backyard generating a little bit of electricity, but that's because I'm a hippie. If I wasn't a hippie, I don't want to generate my own electricity. Why would I want to do that? I just want to turn the light switch on. It's the same kind of deal. It's that utility model. It's abstracting everything out that isn't your core competency.
And as a developer too, the other piece of that is that your expertise are in .NET and storage and that sort of stuff, which is that middle piece, right? Why do all the bits around the outside when somebody else can look after that for a small charge for you? So the opportunity as a developer is to build an application but not have to build all of the infrastructure and other things that sit around that, because the cloud is there and you can use the functionality of the cloud to do that. There's also some opportunities from an infrastructure perspective, but this is particularly for those who are in a company such as one of our partners, maybe GenI, Datacom, Intergen, Provoke, pick one, and where you're providing infrastructure as part of your business. There's an opportunity today to actually go out and sell these cloud solutions. They're actually out there today. For instance, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and so on. You can charge those and sell those today. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. Now, when you sell those products, not only are you selling just that subscription-based product, but on top of that, there's the opportunity to come alongside the customer and say, well, hey, Mr. Customer, we can move how would you like to reduce the price of your mail infrastructure by about half? And they'll say, well, yeah, I'm very interested in that. And so you say, well, look, it's $8.62 per user per month. That's New Zealand. That's how much it costs for Exchange Online. You can say to them, well, we'll move your mail, $8.62 per user per month, we'll move your mail into the cloud, and for an extra $15, $20, $25, $40, $100 per user, you pick the number, we'll migrate each one of those users into the cloud for you. Okay, so what you're trying to tell me there is that for 100 users, say $25 a head, that's $2,500 to migrate my users into the cloud, $8.62 per user per month, and then I have no more requirements for my geo-redundant cluster of Exchange servers? That's right. Why wouldn't I do that? And so the opportunity here for you is to actually go and do that work. Not only that, another area that businesses, particularly, partners often leave money on the table is around business consulting and migration. And I think this is one of the really big changes that the cloud is going to usher in. Because the idea of being a company that just does infrastructure, just does IT, is going to become harder and harder to show value from. And so as an organisation that's doing that today, we need to start thinking, how do I take my current business model and make it more valuable, not to the IT department of my customers, but to the business of my customers. And so this idea of selling business consulting and even training as well. And the classic one with training is, for instance, with SharePoint. And as a SharePoint product manager, I often see this. customer wants to buy SharePoint, all good, partner says, yeah, we'll design it, give you a nice front end, we'll put some basic functionality in there for you, you can run it up and it'll just work, it's great. And the customer says, fantastic. Inevitably though, what happens is that the end users of that solution, not the IT department that bought it, but the end users actually have to use it at some stage. And the problem with that is that they then turn up and on this day they're used to using some other solution, they turn up, SharePoint's there and they're like, so how do I use this? And they go from knowing how to use this other product to not knowing how to use SharePoint. And it's not that hard to learn, right? But there's still this opportunity there as a business, as an IT company, to come along and provide more value and say, hey, why don't we at the same time work with your end users to make sure they know how to use SharePoint, to make sure they know how to create their own sites, their own document libraries and lists, and all that sort of thing. And that doesn't go away with the cloud, because SharePoint doesn't change in that sense in the cloud. And so there's an opportunity to provide more value to the business than to the IT department and make more money out of this. Now, you might be sitting there going, well, that's all very well, Daryl, but, I am quite happy earning several $1 million per year for looking after my customers exchanging SharePoint servers. Why on earth would I want to go and jeopardize that by selling this cloud stuff? Well, let's answer that with another scenario. Let's just say we take a customer of yours and you look after their exchange and their SharePoint for the moment, maybe there'll be other things in the future, and with that solution you charge them, let's say, $250,000 a year for maintenance, backup, restored, maybe help desk support, that sort of stuff. That's a nice little number, $250,000 a year. I'd be happy with that. But then your competitor comes along and says, well, that's all very well, but $17.24 per user per month, which is the whole of the Microsoft Online Services suite, that's what we'll charge you. Never mind this $250,000 thing for 200 users or whatever it happens to be. Does that sound attractive to you, Mr. Customer? The next customer says, well, why wouldn't it? That sounds a heap cheaper than what I'm currently paying. And so there's the reason, right? This is the reason why you want to be doing this today, because if you're not going to do it, someone else is going to do it. And your customers are going to have a really, really hard time looking at their business and saying, what's the value I'm getting for paying twice the amount of money to somebody else to what I'm paying today? And so if we're not doing this, and this is really hard, don't get me wrong, I'm not coming at this flippantly saying, throw your business out the window, it doesn't matter. No. We understand that this is a big deal. We understand that this is going to drive a lot of change in the industry. We know this is going to be hard. But the realistic issue here is that if we're not going to do it to ourselves, then someone else is going to do it to us. It's not something we can stand by and just hope that it will just pass us by like Larry Ellison. It's not going to work that way. If we don't do it, somebody else is. And this is one of the things, right? Microsoft. People look at Microsoft and go, well, Microsoft's this big company, they make all this money out of Office and Windows, they'll never jeopardize that. And I say, watch this space. Because we know that we're going to have our lunch eaten if we don't do something. And in fact, we've known that for a long time. And so we're working very hard right now to change our business models. And you're going to see a lot of activity in this space over the next 12 to 18 months as we bring new products and new licensing schemes on board. They're going to take our traditional business model and radically transform it. Nobody's standing still here. We all know that this is going to be something that's going to change from underneath us. And if we're not going to do it to ourselves, someone else is going to do it to us. And that doesn't leave us in a position of strength. There's also opportunities as an end business, as a consuming business, to take advantage of this. And obviously there's a lot of cost savings that can be had from this. Why would you not look at halving the cost of managing your email? Why would you not look at putting in a collaboration solution for a fraction of the price of what it would buy to actually buy just the service for that collaboration service? One of the classic objections we've had at Microsoft for a while, particularly around Office, is I've got Office 2003. Why should I upgrade to Office 2007 or 2010? What I have is good enough. I can write documents, I can get my email. And you know what the fundamental message there is? It's good enough. And so when you go to the cloud and you look at the solution and you look at the feature set and you go, well, yeah, but Exchange Online doesn't do public folders. Or Gmail. It's kind of got some things missing. Like, for instance, I want to be able to book resources. You know what? For the price difference we're talking, customers probably not going to be too worried about some of those functions. They might be. There might be some things, particularly with PAs, who tend to get quite shirty if you take away their resource bookings and such things. But there might be some things that are going to be critical. But a lot of the time, good enough is going to be fine for what your businesses are going to want to do, particularly when we're talking about halving the cost of some of their infrastructure or better. For that customer too, it gives them dramatic agility. You take a customer, take a company for instance, you've got 100 users, and let's say you buy a company with 900 users in it. They happened fairly recently, I think, with the IT companies in New Zealand. A small company takes over a big company. Now, to go from 100 users to 1,000 users for an email system means going from maybe your one server exchange box to a geo-redundant solution, which means it's going to be up all the time and it's going to be across multiple data centers and so on. That's a massive cost difference. But what if I can just go onto the internet and I can just sort of say, I've got 100 licenses of Exchange Online, let's add another 900, bang, done. Very little cost. In fact, I can do that as I bring those users over department by department. That gives the business a lot of agility. No longer do they have to take that Lotus solution and that Exchange solution and try and munge them together and do this. They don't have to do all that migration. They can migrate once from their on-premises to the cloud, which is what they're currently using, and it gives them the agility to do that quickly. This means, of course, too, that they can take advantage of Microsoft's economies of scale, or Google's, or whoever's. I'm sure you wouldn't want to do that. But, I don't know if you know this, but one of the things that's one of the hidden gems with cloud computing is that the bigger you build these things, the cheaper it is per user to provide. So, if I'm a partner here in New Zealand, say, and I think I'm going to build a private cloud for a bunch of customers, the price that you're going to be able to do that for when you provide 2 racks full of servers is nothing compared to what it's going to cost Microsoft to do it from multiple containers of servers. And by the way, that's kind of how we're buying servers now. At Microsoft, we get a shipping container. HP builds them with about 3,000 CPUs in it. We ship that shipping container. We literally drop it into a data center, plug it into a hose for water cooling, and plug it into the local hydroelectric system. And it just goes. It just comes online and away it goes. That's kind of how we're building them. So our new data centers now are really just a big warehouse, and we just plug all these containers into them, 3,000 at a time. We'll come back to that in a minute. So those economies of scale are now then available to you as a business to take advantage of, which means that you reduce your total cost of ownership by a massive amount, and your return on investment goes right up, because the amount of money you're paying for that solution is so low compared to what it would be if you were doing it yourself. And another really nice thing here from a small business perspective is that one of the things as a small business in the past has been, I'm just going to go with what's cheap. I can't afford to put an Exchange server on. I can't afford to make my system redundant, so I'm just going to go with Gmail or whatever it happens to be. But the nice thing about the cloud now is if you take advantage of these things, you get to take advantage of the best of breed technology, and it's now within the reach of those small businesses. So it's got some challenges as well, though. I'm going to let Ben take you through those, and I might interject here and there maybe.
I like the way that Daryl gets the opportunities and I get the challenges. There's some real equity going on there. So this stuff isn't all easy, and there's a lot of people that are feeling really threatened right now. There's people that are sitting in IT departments, exchange managers sitting within a corporate. Pretty much they're screwed. No, they're not. They're not screwed. There's a job for them at Microsoft or Google, but chances are there's not going to be a job for them working within the business they are currently. I've got this theory, and I know it's this crazy theory, but the IT department should actually be providing value for the business, should actually be a strategic partner of the business. You're going to hear there's a talk tomorrow, I think, from the IT manager from the New Zealand Rugby Union. I was talking to him last night about their reasons for doing the cloud stuff that they are, and I won't give away all his secrets, but it was really interesting talking to him, because pretty much his perspective was that if he can't add value, if they're doing something that someone else can do better for less money, then why would he keep control of that? At the end of the day, the IT department should be a partner for the business, should be a partner of the CEO, should understand the strategic direction that the business is going in, and should be offering up value to let it get there. If they're spending their time hugging servers and upgrading software and doing low-level desktop support, they're not being a strategic partner. All they're doing is all the stuff that isn't core to their business, unless, of course, they are a server hugger company or a desktop management company, in which case they're Microsoft or Google or Amazon, which is fine. So that's all good. So there are some issues there, and I'm not trying to belittle it. All I'm saying is that if you're doing stuff that is very commoditized, then the opportunities for you are probably going to be away from traditional corporates and with the big technology companies. If you're doing other stuff within IT, then that's great, but just think about ways in which you can move to a more value-adding situation rather than just kind of maintaining the status quo. There are some perceived risks around cloud computing. The first one's security. I run a bunch of events around Australasia and around the world called Cloud Camps, which are like an unconferencey, touchy-feely cloud computing event. And every time I run a cloud camp, the first thing that comes up is security. Yeah, but what happens because if my data's not in my data center and it's somewhere over there, someone else can get access. And you know, I've been through some of these data centers, and there's absolutely no way that any company in New Zealand, well, Fonterra, our biggest company, there is no way that they can afford to build a data center to the level that a Google and Amazon and Microsoft and IBM or whoever can build one to. There's simply no way. So I would argue that security is actually a red herring, and that you can't afford to not go to the cloud if security is what you're talking about. There are some other risks, and we had a question here before about, in particular, about Microsoft, where the data is hosted. There are some jurisdictional issues. So this is kind of like, hang on, but if my data is sitting in a data center in the US, then under the Patriot Act, the US feds can get to my data. And that is actually a valid issue. And so I personally think, putting on my independent, non-Microsoft perspective, I think there's a challenge there for vendors, and what's going to happen is very, very soon, and it's already starting to happen, you'll see vendors offering real sort of geographic granularity around the data, where the data is stored. So at the moment, Microsoft, as far as I'm aware, has Europe, the US and Singapore, but the way they're building their data centers now, and other providers are doing similarly, is through containers, dropping containers everywhere. And Microsoft recently announced this thing that Daryl will talk about called the Azure Appliance, which basically means that a partner that has a bunch of infrastructure can do a cloud computing play around Azure. And so what you'll see is you will see local providers start to offer this stuff. There's nothing really here yet, and it's difficult in New Zealand because we're a pretty small market, but it is coming, and that's a challenge for vendors. So absolutely, that is a risk, and you need to do your due diligence. But any buying decision you make in business, you need to do your due diligence. This isn't a cloud is bad, cloud is risky. This is, when we make a buying decision, we need to do due diligence. We need to check on the SLAs, service level agreements with the vendor. We need to do all this stuff. We may need to make an informed buying decision. Nothing's changed with that. Our job is to make informed buying decisions. So the last risk, and this is a valid risk, is the ease of entry. I talked before about how easy it is to set up a startup in the cloud using cloud tools. And that ease of entry can mean that things are quite unstable. So there have been there've been a couple of examples where stuff has gone bad, where data's been lost, or a startup has gone under and all the data's been lost, or whatever. So again, stuff can happen in the same way as when you rely on a document shredding company, you can send out some confidential information that actually doesn't get shredded and gets sold to the Russian mafia. So what you got to do, you just do your due diligence over the shredding company, make sure they're actually going to shred it. Same story. When you're making a buying decision about software, just make sure that you're buying from a reputable vendor, that there's some service level agreements in place, that there's contracts in place, and pay the lawyers their $200 an hour or whatever to go through the contracts and make sure you're safe. So yes, there's challenges, but the challenges aren't insurmountable, and a lot of the time they're artificial barriers to the cloud.
And so, I guess in summary, these are out there today. They're out there today for you to take advantage of. They're pretty cost effective. Like I said before, the Microsoft Online Services, you can buy the whole suite, 4 products, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Office Communications Server Online, So we've got data centers around the world, right? So I'll give you a second, Tim Tam. So we've got data centers around the world. So we've got, for Microsoft Online Services, we have data centers in Singapore, Dublin, and in the US. For Azure, they're all at the moment, I think, in the US. I think there might be something in Europe, but there's nothing in Asia Pacific. What we're seeing with regards to latency between here and Singapore is around the 150 to 180 millisecond response time to the Singapore data center. So, CDN.
Content delivery then?
Yeah.
Part of Azure?
Yep. So Azure sort of got its own system for sorting that out, yeah. Which we see quite fine. So for instance, when the rugby union went to online services, what they said is, we asked them how is it performing, and they said, well, it takes a little bit longer for something to leave the outbox. But that's it. That's really the only thing they noticed. Yeah. So if a user is using Office Online, how much bandwidth is there? There is a bandwidth calculator, and I would encourage you, if you're going to take up online services, to download that bandwidth calculator. I haven't got a link, unfortunately. But if you're a partner, you can sign up to, you're in the partner program, you can sign up to quickstartonlineservices.com, and on there you'll be able to download that bandwidth calculator. You'll find that it depends on what you're doing and how you're using it. So it's not. 6.5 hours. Yeah.
You probably want to have
Yeah,
an
we'll have that afterwards. We'll take it
in-depth
offline.
conversation with Daryl.
Yeah.
Any other really